What's up guys, my name is Alex. Welcome to this new video. Today we'll be comparing the original iPad Air first generation against the brand new 2020 iPad Air 4th generation. So let's get started right away. So the iPad Air 1 here on the right side was released in 2013 and it packs an A7 dual-core processor running at 1.4 GHz as well as 1 GB of RAM. This was also the first 64-bit chip in a mobile device. The iPad Air 4 here on the left side was released in 2020 and it packs an A14 chip, which is a 6-core chip running at 2.99 GHz with 4 GB of RAM. And rather than being a regular processor with 6 identical cores, the Air 4, or rather the A14, has 2 high-performance cores and 4 high-efficiency cores. Right, let's quickly run a benchmark just to see the difference in performance between these two chips. So we'll run Geekbench 5 on both the iPad Air 4 and on the iPad Air 1. So let's go. And as we can see, the iPad Air 4 has just finished, whilst the iPad Air 1 is not even halfway done. And as you can see, the first generation iPad Air has finally finished as well, and unsurprisingly, it has a much lower score compared to the iPad Air 4 right here. So yes, as I said, massive performance difference between these two, both on paper and in regular use. Now, the iPad Air first generation is by no means really slow or anything, unlike these numbers might lead you to believe. But it definitely is noticeable how much faster the Air 4 is. But then, as I said, don't get me wrong, the Air is still very much usable, definitely not fast, but it's not horribly slow either. So the original iPad Air from 2013 is the first major design change since the iPad 2, and I guess you could also include the first generation iPad from 2010, since they didn't change that much from the first gen to the second gen. In terms of design, the overall size of the Air did shrink quite a lot. Firstly, we've got slimmer bezels compared to the previous iPads, and we've got a much thinner profile. In fact, the iPad Air started looking much more like a 5th and later generation iPod Touch. The iPad Air 4, on the other hand, has a completely different design to the original iPads. It is based on the 2018 iPad Pro design, which itself was based on the iPhone X's edge-to-edge design, as well as the flat sides from older iPhones like the 5 or the 4 or the 5S, the SE from 2016, etc., or even like the new iPhones 12 and 12 Pro. And obviously enough, the Air 4, as well as the iPad Pros, lack the home button and they use the gesture navigation system introduced with the iPhone X. But then again, with iOS 11, I believe, but definitely 12, this gesture navigation system has been introduced to older iPads, and in fact, as you can see, I can use the exact same gestures right here on the first generation iPad Air from 2013. The screen on the original iPad Air is a 9.7-inch 2048 by 1536 Retina display, which honestly hasn't really changed that much compared to the previous two iPads that came before the original Air, those being the iPad 3rd Gen and the iPad 4th Gen. The iPad Air 4, on the other hand, has a completely different display. So firstly, it's no longer a 4:3 aspect ratio like the classic or more traditional looking iPads. Instead, it is now a 4.3:3 aspect ratio, meaning that it's just a little bit wider. Aside from the aspect ratio, the display is bigger. As you can see, it is 10.9 inches and the resolution is 2360 by 1640. The pixel density, however, is exactly the same. So although this display is bigger and has a higher resolution, they have the exact same pixel density of 264 pixels per inch, meaning that they will look equally as sharp. One big difference between these two is that the Air The original Air does not have a laminated display, which means that you can see a little gap between the LCD and the actual glass, and touching the display has a bit more of a hollow feeling than a solid feeling. This is, however, not the case with the iPad Air 4, as the display is fully laminated, there is no gap, and touching it gives a much more solid feeling. In addition, having a laminated display gives us much less reflections, as well as a brighter image overall. This is not to say that the original iPad Air's display is bad by any means. In fact, I used it for 7 years straight, and I haven't really had any concerns or any major problems with it. But once you do put them side by side, or even if you put a original iPad Air side by side to any of the smaller devices, such as the iPod Touches or the iPhones, which all have laminated display, that's when you do start noticing the difference and just how much better having a laminated display is. The original iPad Air ran iOS 7 out of the box back when it was first released, whereas nowadays it is running iOS 12, specifically iOS 12.4.9, which was released just a few days ago. There we go, 12.4.9 iPad Air first generation. The iPad Air 4, on the other hand, is running iOS 14.2, or should I say iPadOS 14.2. Personally, I don't really understand that change in naming scheme, since they kept the iPhone OS as iOS rather than iPhone OS. But there it is, Apple's done it. This is iPadOS 14, this is iOS 12. Not much to say really about iPadOS 14, except that it's absolutely great. It does take advantage of the bigger screen and the processing power packed in the A14 much better compared to iOS 12, which feels much more like a blown up smartphone experience than a dedicated tablet experience. Now, somewhat counterintuitively, it's actually a really good thing that this Air is running iOS 12 for two main reasons. Firstly, its performance. It does run pretty well for what it is. As you saw, the Geekbench scores were very different, but the iPad Air, as I already said, really is not that slow. And I believe it would have become really slow with iPadOS 13 or 14 due to only having 1 gig of RAM compared to 4. But yeah, it does run iOS 12 pretty well, and the second reason is that the vast majority of apps, I dare say over 90% of the apps on the App Store, run on iOS 12 just fine. So really, it's not too different from a modern iPad experience. One key difference in philosophy between these two devices from Apple is the type of port that they use. Now, the iPad Air first generation still uses the Lightning connector, which Apple introduced way back in 2012 with the iPhone 5. And personally, I don't really have that many complaints about the Lightning connector, except that it's proprietary. And we do also have a headphone jack on the original iPad Air. The iPad Air 4, on the other hand, does not have a headphone jack. However, it does have a USB Type-C port instead of a Lightning port, which is much more versatile, much more open, and it reduces the number of cables and chargers that you need to carry around. So in terms of dimensions, as you can see, the iPad Air 4 is ever so slightly bigger than the original iPad Air. Obviously it does have a much bigger display, but in terms of actual device size, there's not that big of a difference. The iPad Air first generation weighs 469 grams for the Wi-Fi version and 478 grams for the LTE version. I've got the Wi-Fi version here, so it's 469 grams, whereas the iPad Air 4 weighs 458 grams for the Wi-Fi version and 460 grams for the LTE version. So I've got the LTE version of the Air 4 and the Wi-Fi version of the Air 1, and there's only a 9 gram difference in weight between the two according to the specs, but I have to say the Air 4 is noticeably lighter. Not by a huge margin, but it is noticeable. And the last thing that is way more noticeable than I thought it'd be is the difference in thickness. So the Air 1 is 7.5 millimeters thick, whereas the Air 4 is 6.1 millimeters thick, which is really thin. Now this is one of the things that impressed me the most about this iPad Air is the thinness. This is very thin. It's even thinner than my old iPod Touch 4th generation, which for the longest time was the slimmest device I ever owned. And let's just see the difference in thickness. It might not look like it on camera, but the iPod Touch is quite clearly thicker in real life. Not by a huge margin, but it is thicker. If we compare instead against something like the 5th generation iPod Touch, which is also 6.1 millimeters thin, here we do see that they are pretty much the same, although the curved design of the iPod Touch does make it look and feel just a little bit slimmer. As for the cameras, we've got a 5 megapixel rear-facing camera on the iPad Air 1st Gen, which can record videos at 1080p 30 fps. This is pretty comparable to what we found on the iPhone 4S, whereas the iPad Air 4 is pretty similar to what the iPhones 10 and 10s can do with its 12 megapixel rear-facing sensor that can do video at up to 4K 60 frames per second. Now the front-facing camera difference is even greater. The original iPad Air 1 sports a 1.2 megapixel front-facing camera, which can only record up to 720p 30 fps, whereas the iPad Air 4 can record 1080p 60 fps and take photos at 7 megapixels. Another difference between the two is the speakers. So the original iPad Air only has speakers on the bottom. These are stereo with left and right channels. However, they are all on one side, meaning that when you watch, when you're using the device vertically, it's not really a problem because the speakers are pretty much firing at you. Yes, they're firing down, but the bottom side of the device is kind of angled towards you when you use it. So they kind of are firing towards you. No real problems there. They do sound obviously not massive in terms of bass and highs and mids, but they do sound pretty acceptable for tablet use. The iPad Air 4, on the other hand, has 4 speaker grills, but only 2 speakers, because this is recycling the shell of the iPad Pro 11-inch. So it has 4 speaker grills, but only 2 actual speakers, which, when I put it in this orientation with the power button here, the speakers that actually do produce sound are the grills at the bottom here. Or if you hold it vertically, that would be the grills on the left-hand side. The other ones, I believe, are either only there to echo the actual speakers to make it just that little bit louder, or I guess they're just dummies because they literally reuse the iPad Pro shell. Finally, my absolute favorite feature personally, because this is my personal upgrade from the iPad Air 1st Gen, which I've had pretty much since release, 7 years straight, to the brand new iPad Air 4. The main thing that I'm really happy about, aside from the obvious stuff like performance and display, is Touch ID on the iPad Air 4. I am so tired of entering my passcode into the original iPad Air, since it does not have any sort of biometric security lock or anything like that. It doesn't have Touch ID. It's got the old traditional home button. Does not have Face ID. It's just got a mediocre front-facing camera. So all you're left with is use it with no passcode, or use a passcode and enter it every single time. With the iPad Air 4, on the other hand, we do have a Touch ID sensor, which is not on the home button, because obviously we don't have a home button. Is actually in the power button, which is a really interesting choice. It is something we've seen before with many Android devices. One that comes to mind is the Samsung Galaxy S10e, which had a fingerprint sensor in the power button as well. Do correct me if I'm wrong, but I do believe that was the case. Another reason why this is interesting is because the iPad Pros, which use the exact same design, have Face ID, just like on the newer iPhones 10 and newer, except for the 2020 SE. And apparently it really was not an easy thing to do, to put a Touch ID sensor in the power button. There was an article recently that I read from, I believe, an Apple engineer who said that this was really tricky to implement, especially with interference from the Wi-Fi and LTE antennas, but they did it. It works great. Position is perfectly fine for me, but what I'm most happy about is that it is there in the first place. so I don't have to enter my passcode every single time anymore. The final thing I want to do today is a quick performance test by launching a few applications. So the first thing I'm going to do is completely close everything that is currently open on both of these iPads. Right, so every application has been closed on both iPads. We've got nothing running in the background. So let's start with this application launching test. So let's start with the App Store, which tends to be surprisingly one of the most demanding built-in apps. iPad Air 4, pretty much instant. iPad Air 1st Gen did not take too long actually, but you do notice that it is slower. I'm actually quite surprised at how much quicker than I expected it to be, or than I remembered rather, the App Store was to open on the original iPad Air. And finally, let's try YouTube, because this is, realistically, this is where I spend most of my time with these iPads. Instant on the iPad Air 4 pretty much, at least when it comes to loading the app. iPad Air 1 catching up, almost there, right, ready to go. Just a few seconds behind the iPad Air 4th generation. That's it for today. I hope you enjoyed the video. There's going to be more content coming up relating to the iPad Air 4, so do subscribe if you want to see those. On top of that, I've got an iPhone XS, MacBook Pro 2019 and iPhone 12 Pro reviews coming up, so do subscribe if you don't want to miss those. That's it from me. I'll see you next time.